quick question. If I described someone to you as born male, began wearing women's clothing around puberty, did work traditionally associated with women, what word would you use for that person?
I'm sorry, are you describing me? Probably transgender.
Right. I would have said that too. And I think that's a very normal and natural instinct because, like, on paper, that description maps almost perfectly onto what you and I understand as, like, a trans woman's experience. I mean, you said it. That's pretty much my exact experience growing up.
Right. All right. So where are we going with this, Dany?
So the catch here is that the person I'm describing with that would have been deeply confused.
Sure.
Not offended, but definitely confused because that concept, that framework didn't exist in their world.
Whose world?
In their world, there was already a word for what they were. It's a different word.
What?
One that meant something
What?
that our language has never quite been able to hold.
Dany, I'm on the edge of my seat. What are we talking about?
Incoming broadcast. You're listening to .fm.
Welcome to .fm. I'm your host, Danielle Gonzalez.
I'm Claire. Hi.
And today we're going to be talking about Wewa.
Oh, Wewa.
A cultural ambassador from Zuni Pueblo in New Mexico, an artist, ceremonial leader, and arguably one of the most famous Native Americans of the 1880s, even if Washington, D.C. never quite understood who they were actually meeting. Lhamana.
What did you just say?
So here's a little bit of how to pronounce it. I'm not sure my pronunciation is perfect, and there's no like super clear like way to translate sounds from like the Zuni language into English.
Sure.
But you take your tongue, put it at the roof of your mouth like you're going to pronounce, the sound for the letter L.
La.
But then instead of making that sound, you just kind of force air around the sides of your tongue. So tla.
Oh, it's like a TH almost.
Almost.
Lhamana.
Lhamana.
Okay, cool.
And to be clear here, we're only scratching the surface of Zuni culture. Like, I'm not going to go into too much detail because it's not really my place to speak authoritatively on a culture that I don't fully understand. But before we can even talk about Wewa, we need to talk about the world that they were born into.
Sure.
Because understanding Wewa without understanding Zuni culture is kind of like trying to understand Darth Vader without understanding the Galactic Civil War. Context is everything here. The Zuni people, or Ashiwi as they call themselves, are a Pueblo people, which is an indigenous nation whose ancestral homeland is in what's now the American Southwest, mainly New Mexico. Zuni are very distinctive in a lot of ways. They have their own language, which is actually a language isolate, which means it's not related to any other known language on Earth. There's no known ancestor language, no known relatives.
Okay.
You know how English is like Germanic and like Spanish is like a Latin-based language?
Yeah.
Zuni is kind of its own thing. And that actually matters a lot for what we're talking about, because the Zuni also had concepts and words for things that English just doesn't have equivalents for.
Sure.
And that's going to be very central to what we're talking about today. So at the heart of Zuni culture is this concept of the middle. The Zuni call their home the middle place, at the center of 6 directions: north, south, east, west, up, and down.
Interesting.
And when we're talking about this, it's not just geography, it's like philosophy. Everything in Zuni life is oriented around the idea of balance, of finding the middle, and then once you find it, maintaining it.
Wait, I think I see where this is going. Trans, middle, is this what we're talking about?
Kind of.
Or what is it the middle of exactly?
It's more than that. It's like the middle of everything. Between the universe, the community, yourself.
Okay.
The way the Zuni talked about this was through this concept of the onane, which means the life road. Each person has their own onane, or life road. The goal is to travel down the middle of that road.
Oh, I like where this is going.
Not too far to one side, not too far to the other.
Cool.
And if you can do that, if you can maintain that balance, you'll have a long, smooth road, a long and happy life.
100%. Let's go.
Right. And it's really beautiful. I mean, there's a word for the way of living that kind of keeps you on that smooth road. It's called kokshi. It roughly translates to be good, be obedient, be attractive. But really what that means is live in a way that promotes human survival and happiness.
Yeah.
Anything that kind of keeps the community in balance is kokshi.
Okay. All right.
Right. And that communal orientation shows up everywhere in Zuni life. Decisions were made by consensus.
Yeah.
Any official, both religious or secular, could be removed from their position by public outcry, essentially impeached. The society was matrilineal. It was organized through mothers and daughters and common female ancestors. And importantly, the work, the basic labor that kept everyone alive, that kept society moving, was divided in a way that was deeply complementary.
Like a balance.
Yeah, so Zuni society divided responsibilities roughly along gender lines.
Oh.
But the way that Zuni anthropologist Edmund Ladd describes it is, quote, men are responsible for the universe, women are responsible for the family and the tribe. And when he says universe, what he means is religion, ceremony, the spiritual labor that kept all things, the cosmos itself in balance.
So in traditional, culture, women handle, basket weaving, and men are handling hunting and all the heavy stuff. So how do women in the Zuni culture handle things? How do men in the Zuni culture handle things?
Men ran major religious ceremonies, but they also had other specific duties. I mean, men weaved, textiles.
Sure.
They made jewelry and tools. They defended the pueblo. They hunted in the fall and planted corn in the spring, though importantly, they didn't harvest. They weren't allowed in the granaries or the storehouses because that was the women's domain. Women stored and distributed the corn. They cooked. They made pottery. They did basketry. They gathered and gardened. But crucially, they owned the houses. In fact, a phrase Will Roscoe uses in his book is pretty striking. He says, women's titleship of the house was absolute. A woman always had a home. If she wanted to divorce her husband, all she did was place his things outside the doorstep. There's no ceremony, no ritual, just done. He'd come home, see his things on the doorstep, but he would know what that meant, pick up his stuff, and then go back to his mom's house.
Damn, modern feminism is at it again.
Oh, and women had full bodily autonomy and sexual freedom.
Oh, really?
There was actually no concept of illegitimate children. Kids belonged to the mother's family, and child rearing was this communal responsibility.
Well, that's how it should be.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that particular context really matters for understanding Wewa, because lhamana existed in a society that already held women in genuine esteem. So, this wasn't a man dressing as a woman to access a subordinate class, kind of the way that conservatives today might have you believe.
Oh, yeah.
Women weren't subordinate.
Right.
In fact, Roscoe tells about a study that happened in the 1950s when children were asked what they would like to be if they could change into anything. And 10% of Zuni boys said they'd like to become girls or their sisters. Both roles were essential, they were distinct, and they were respected.
Can we just sit with that for a second again? Because that was really, really awesome. Women weren't subordinate.
Right.
Damn.
So men and women are two halves of kind of the same whole almost.
Okay.
And the Zuni understood that they understood this concept very literally through their religious institutions. So the major institutions, the major ones were the Kachina Society, which was a religious group to which all adult men belonged. And it was organized into 6 subgroups. And the Kachina were the Zuni deities. So the society performed ceremonies that maintained their relationship with those deities.
Okay, how did they decide which subgroup they were in?
So this is actually one of my most favorite details that I learned about this.
Okay.
Because it's so... Let me just explain it to you. So
go on, Dany, do it.
Your affiliation with a particular subgroup was determined by the clan affiliation of the husband of the midwife who assisted your birth and first touched you when you were born.
Whoa.
Got it? Did that make sense to you?
Hang on. The clan affiliation of the husband of the midwife who touched you when you were born.
Right.
That's really specific.
I know. And so random, right?
Yeah. Okay.
And I think it's really wonderful. I really like that because that sort of randomness meant that boys were introduced to a lot of different people and not just kept in small insular communities. So it really kind of created this social cohesion. But Kachina society wasn't the only group. There were also medicine societies that were called Societies of the Completed Path. And these were open to both men and women. And they were called Societies of the Completed Path because they allowed people who were threatened by illness or injury to recover and complete their life road.
Oh, cool. All right. I'm digging Zuni culture.
Then there's also the Rain Priests, which were these 6 priests who led the theocracy, and they were sworn to non-violence. They couldn't participate in violence in any way.
Wow.
So the Rain Priests also appointed 2 members of the Warrior Society to be what's called Bow Priests. And these 2 Bow Priests were kind of the executive arm of the theocracy. They would announce the decisions of the Rain Priests and also enforce them, make sure they were being followed.
Sure.
So now that we have a basic understanding, this is kind of this carefully balanced, communally oriented, and very spiritually rich world is the world that Wewa was born into.
Okay.
So 1849 was a pretty important year in terms of Zuni history. It was the first year that the Zuni had significant contact with the Americans. And a U.S. Army expedition led by Lieutenant Colonel John Washington arrived at Zuni Pueblo in 1849. And the Zuni welcomed them pretty eagerly because at this point, the Americans were more or less at war with the Navajo people. And the Zuni had pretty frequent conflict with the Navajo. So they kind of saw the Americans as these potential allies against the Navajo that could help protect them.
Yeah, so the American relationship started fine.
Yeah, it started okay. But the Americans did bring some stuff with them that wasn't great. Smallpox. So around 1853, both of Wewa's parents died in a smallpox epidemic.
Wow.
And Wewa was about 4 years old.
Oh, so she lost both of her parents.
Yeah. And that detail is especially important because, remember, in Zuni culture, it's matrilineal. So Wewa remained a member of his mother's clan, but he was adopted by a paternal aunt who was a member of his father's clan. And in Zuni, aunts and uncles were like extra parents. For example, maternal aunts were actually called older mother or little mother, depending on their age. So, the family structure was genuinely communal in a way that we're not really used to.
I also noticed that you're using he, not she.
Right.
Okay. Well, how did Wewa actually, get past this part of his life? Was he living with relatives? Was he living with the tribe? Was he living someplace else?
So Wewa was adopted into his paternal aunt's family, and she became his adopted mother. And his adoptive family was very well connected and pretty influential. Wewa's foster father, Jose Paye, was a very respected rain priest.
And rain priests were the ones who were sworn to nonviolence, right?
Right. They were the ones that led the theocracy. And here's something I found pretty fascinating from Roscoe's book. Before the age of 5 or 6, Zuni children were presented and referred to without any reference to gender.
Wow.
Parents actually referred to them as chale. It just means child.
Sure.
So really no distinction between gender early on. Boys and girls wore their hair in the same short style. So gender in any, socially meaningful sense just hadn't been assigned.
I've heard that this is like relatively common in more ancient times. But like, I guess, when does gender get assigned for the Zuni tribe?
Well, that's the cool part. So in Zuni culture, gender is never assigned.
What?
It's never assigned to you. It's something that you form, kind of create it yourself.
You adopt. You're like, I feel more aligned with, this is amazing.
Think of it like this. Everyone is like raw material.
Yeah.
Not yet, cooked. And the process of cooking, say, a boy, for instance, consisted of 2 initiations that started with the first initiation that sort of brings you into the Kachina society. The first initiation happens between the ages of 4 and 8 years old in this ceremony that's held every 4 years. And this first ceremony centers on kind of farming and craftswork. Boys would learn the ancient Zuni origin myth and their urge to be brave and kind. And then, after that first initiation, the religious training kind of begins in earnest. Things like memorizing songs, prayers, myths, ceremonial lore.
Where is Weiwa in all of this then?
Well, Weiwa did all of this, and apparently he kind of excelled at it. Oh. The memorization, the ritual knowledge, Weiwa was described by basically everybody who knew him as exceptionally intelligent. There's a famous anthropologist, Matilda Cox Stevenson, who we'll talk about a little bit later. She called him the most intelligent, the strongest, most active, and most progressive in the tribe.
Wow.
So, high praise. But somewhere in this period, and we don't know exactly when or how, but Weiwa's lhamana inclinations, as Roscoe refers to it, become apparent. And Roscoe says that, these kind of inclinations could be very subtle. It might be as simple as assuming a feminine role when playing childhood games. Kids play house, and it could be that, a young boy's I'll be the mom kind of thing.
Yeah, like I did when I was young and I did the gender switched roles.
Right.
Totally no signs there. None at all.
Or it could be as simple as just wearing a longer shirt and leaving it untucked from your pants to kind of mimic, a dress or a skirt or a blouse.
Yeah.
But sometimes it was definitely more overt, like wearing a piece of clothing that was specifically for girls and women.
Yeah.
But regardless, however it manifested, the community recognized it when it did and then fostered that. Yeah. And so Weiwa's training shifted when his lhamana inclinations became apparent.
Okay, so viewer, Dany has prepared Weiwa's transition story for us. So I'm going to ask her right now, what is Weiwa's transition story, Dany?
Well, it's not a transition. But Weiwa received the first boys' initiation, the one centered on farming and craftswork.
Yep.
But he never received the second one, which is held between the ages of 10 and 14. And that one focuses more on hunting and warfare. So instead of that second male initiation, Weiwa begins learning from female relatives all of the feminine duties, things like domestic skills, food preparation, pottery, that kind of thing.
Oh man. So Lama go through I can't say this word, Dany.
That's fine.
So anyway, the Lama go through a different initiation, it sounds like. That's kind of what I'm getting, right?
Remember the raw and cooked framework that I brought up earlier?
Yeah.
Children are born raw, and gender is something they're socialized into through initiation and learning. In that framework, lhamana, like Weiwa, were males who were simply cooked differently than the other boys. They received that first male initiation, the one about farming and craft, but they didn't receive the second, the one about hunting and war.
Yeah.
And instead of undergoing women's initiations, which specifically in Zuni culture were tied to biological events like menstruation and childbirth, they received women's lore and ritual knowledge through training and relationship.
So Lama aren't like trans women at all.
Right. It's something else entirely.
Oh!
Here's how Roscoe describes how the Zuni understood that sort of something else.
Okay.
Lhamana were not half man, half woman. they were two complete beings in one. The phrase that he uses from Zuni thought is twofold one kind, with the psychological characteristics of both men and women and the physical strength of both as well.
Okay. All right. I see this is going. We were talking about balance earlier. We're talking about middle. And so like...
Yeah, you're getting there.
Combine one side with the other and it becomes a whole. Okay, I got
the whole of each. And because of that, lhamana occupied a unique position in the community. They could move freely between male and female spaces. They weren't subject to the periodic separations of men and women that Zuni life required at some times. For example, during childbirth, because, infants were raw material, essentially, during childbirth, men were not allowed in the house, because it was thought that they might inadvertently expose that raw newborn to aggression, kind of cook them early, as it were. But lhamana could be everywhere. They could be there during that time. They're kind of these masters of two worlds.
Right.
And this kind of comes through in the kinds of work that lhamana were valued for. Roscoe describes lhamana as craft specialists, people who combine elements of male and female social, economic, and religious roles. And practically speaking, that made them enormously useful to society. When a woman had to step back from her duties, say because she was pregnant or needed maternity leave or something, lhamana could step in. When religious knowledge that crossed gender lines was needed, lhamana had it. They were great at mediating, too.
Yeah, I know. I wish that people would recognize that modern trans people have, perspectives that aren't common. And it sounds like the Zuni culture recognized that. And there's a practical dimension to how they approach these things.
Right. And, that practicality and spirituality were deeply intertwined.
Right.
Here's a piece of Zuni theology that I think is really key to understanding why lhamana were honored rather than just, merely tolerated. So in Zuni mythology, women were seen as more complete than men, kind of, because of their ability to create life. The phrasing is something kind of like, both men and women come from women and women's milk sustains both. So women had this inherent life-giving capacity that men just didn't.
Yeah, so it's a very matriarchal type society where men were inferior.
Well,
not
quite inferior. Men didn't have the inherent ability to create life, but they could gain it in a sense through, religious knowledge and ceremony, by learning how to use ritual to preserve and sustain life in the ways that women just kind of knew naturally. Now, lhamana in this framework lacked the female biological capacity to create life independently, but they did retain what Roscoe calls female potency. And because of that, they combined that with male ceremonial knowledge and represented a kind of wholeness, this completeness, not a compromise or a confusion, but a wholeness.
Tell us about the pottery, Dany.
All right. So the pottery, this is kind of where the theology becomes sort of tactile. The Zuni believed that clay was like the living flesh of Mother Earth, and pots were made beings, like people, actually. In fact, everything handmade was considered living in some way, and the act of making a pot or a basket or a tool was understood to be kind of akin to giving birth, so producing life. Producing life was the domain of women, but making pottery was also producing life in a way. So that meant that Wewa, as lhamana, who mastered pottery, was in fact, in a very real sense, participating in that life-giving capacity. Wewa's crafts were highly sought after, and he was very respected, not just for the quality of the work, but for the status of the one doing it. And there's one detail from Roscoe's account of Wewa's childhood that I keep thinking about. At some point, a Kachina group comes to the Pueblo for a festival. And among them was a lhamana Kachina, or, a deity. And that deity was called Kol Lhamana.
Okay.
And apparently, Wewa was very particularly captivated by this character, this individual.
So, okay. So how does Wewa fit into this? Is she or is he sort of seeing themselves represented by lhamana?
Yeah, I think so. And, in a way that's like not an exception to the natural order. Wewa, let me put it this way. Wewa didn't need to construct an allegory the same way that I see K-pop demon hunters as a trans allegory.
We know what you'd say, Zoe.
Oh, right. We are hunters. Voices strong. Your faults and fears must never be seen.
Right? Like, for Wewa, being lhamana was something the gods themselves embodied. It was something that existed already.
Interesting.
.fm is brought to you by, well, not capitalism, that's for damn sure.
We're powered by queer joy and caffeine, baby!
And our Patreon supporters want to help us keep making weird little episodes like this one? Head to patreon.com/.fem. That's patreon.com/DOTFEMME.
Reacquiring signal.
So by the 1870s, white and Hispanic farmers and ranchers are beginning to encroach on Zuni land. There's a ton of anthropologists and academics that are arriving in this region to document Pueblo life. The Zuni are one of the most written about tribes in the world, and apparently there's an old joke that says that a traditional Zuni household is a mother, a father, some children, and an anthropologist.
Oh, God.
Among these academics arriving to study Zuni in 1879 was a woman named Matilda Cox Stevenson. And she's one of the first professional women anthropologists in America. She comes on an expedition for the newly formed Bureau of American Ethnology.
Let me guess. She met Wewa.
She met Wewa and was immediately captivated. Stevenson describes Wewa as, and I'm paraphrasing here, perhaps the tallest person in Zuni, certainly the strongest, both mentally and physically, with a formidable memory for Zuni lore and for everything she encountered in the outside world. The two struck up this genuine and close friendship that would last the rest of Wewa's life. To Stevenson, Wewa represented a like-minded, intellectual, culturally leading woman. Right.
There's mutual respect.
But there's also tension because the Zuni regarded community members who shared cultural knowledge with outsiders with a bit of suspicion. But despite all that, because Wewa occupied this sort of master of two worlds position in culture, he was able to be that intermediary, be that kind of cultural ambassador. So in December of 1885, Stevenson actually brings Wewa to Washington, D.C. And what ends up happening was like 6 months that to me just feels like it could be a movie.
6 months?
Yeah, 6 cinematic months.
Cinematic months. Hey.
So for 6 months, Wewa is this fixture of Washington high society.
Oh my God.
Attended teas with fashionable ladies, went to this grand ball at the new National Theater, demonstrated Zuni weaving on the National Mall, worked with researchers at the Smithsonian to, talk about his culture, gave interviews, and the press loved him. The papers called Wewa an Indian princess and just could not get enough.
Why did they call him an Indian princess?
So here's what's interesting.
Talk about culture shock.
From all accounts I could find, Wewa never made an attempt to hide his maleness or birth sex. He never tried to pass as a woman the way you and I might think of it.
Okay.
But nobody figured it out.
Okay.
For 6 months, in one of the most socially scrutinized cities in America,
oh my God.
One of my favorite parts of this whole story, Wewa's visit to Washington happened during the summer solstice, which is kind of significant because the solstice is a very sacred time in Zuni culture. And Wewa was not about to let it pass uncelebrated just because he was 3,000 miles away from home.
Right.
He insisted on performing the annual solstice ceremony, but with authentic materials. And since the Zuni are in a community-focused culture, he wanted to do it concurrently with his people back in the Pueblo.
So this is 1800s.
1886.
Did he call them up on the phone and was like, yo, what's up?
Yeah.
How did he coordinate?
I assume it was through telegraph and local messengers.
Yeah.
But the Stevensons helped coordinate the timing between Washington, D.C. and Zuni Pueblo so that Wewa's ceremony and the Pueblo ceremony could happen simultaneously. So Wewa made prayer sticks, which is a male ceremonial duty, using authentic materials from New Mexico that were retrieved from the National Museum.
That's awesome.
And he performed the solstice ceremony in Washington, D.C.
That's awesome.
And white society watched completely enraptured, thinking that,
of course,
they had this view that they were witnessing some Indian priestess performing an exotic spiritual rite. They had no idea that what they were actually watching was a lhamana fulfill a standard male religious obligation in perfect coordination with a Pueblo all the way back in New Mexico.
Nice.
So I'm not entirely sure exactly how this meeting happened, but it seems that, President Cleveland had seen all of these stories about, the exotic Indian princess in his city.
The socialite.
That everyone was taken with. And somehow Wewa was given the opportunity to shake hands with President Cleveland. And the president himself had no idea that Wewa was actually male. In fact, Stevenson herself, Wewa's closest American friend who had known him for years, later admitted that she believed Wewa to be a woman for a long time. In her 1904 anthropological report on the Zuni that she published, she kind of reveals the truth, and it's how she writes about it that I think is so particularly revealing. But she says, so carefully was his sex concealed that for years I believed him to be a woman. And then she adds that she will continue to use the feminine pronoun anyway, because she could never think of her faithful and devoted friend in any other light.
I was wondering where that was going to go. Because on one hand, it's like a forced outing. But on the other hand, it's like, well, here we are, like, implying respect and showing that, like, this is the person that I've met. This is the person that I know.
Right.
It's really beautiful. And also a little heartbreaking. It's cute. Aww.
Isn't it? I mean, here's a trained anthropologist who genuinely loved Wewa, studied Zuni culture for years, and even she couldn't find the right framework for him to fit in. Right? She defaulted to the binary. She made Wewa fit instead of the other way around.
She didn't have the words, right?
She didn't have the word. All right, so here's where I want to bring in something that's been at the center of this episode for me since I started researching it, and especially since I drove all the way out to Zuni Pueblo. And I spoke with some tribal members while I was there, and there was one member who I asked him if there was one thing you wanted an outsider to understand, what would you like me to correct for the record? And what he told me was, don't make assumptions. And specifically, he said, Wewa wasn't transgender. Wewa wasn't gay. Wewa was lhamana.
So what does that distinction mean today then?
Well, I think it means that when we look at Wewa through our modern Western lens and say, that's basically a trans woman, we're doing something that, might be well-intentioned, but it's kind of subtly wrong because we're flattening the image. We're importing our framework onto someone that already had their own,
Right. Well, like, how many times did I correct myself too, just this episode? Like, I might have said trans woman and then realized, like, there was no transition involved. Like, the idea of the word transgender, like, just, it's wrong. It's just simply wrong. It doesn't fit this framework.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's kind of exactly the point I'm trying to make. And, like, wanting to naturally reach for, trans woman, that's not a failure on your part. That's just the limit of the vocabulary that we were all raised and socialized in. We have a binary.
Sure.
We've been slowly building, this outside the binary category with NB and everything, but lhamana didn't emerge from a binary and then transcend it. It emerged from its own completely different understanding of what gender is and what it does.
Something that you become, you adopt, as I've been saying.
Right.
It's not something that you're born as or assigned as.
Right. And in that particular worldview, someone like Wewa, who moved between roles, held both, was twofold one kind. He wasn't transgressing anything. There was nothing to transgress. There was a category and Wewa fit it comfortably, honorably. It was already its own thing.
Right.
But it also means that we need to hold these translations very lightly. Wewa didn't know the term two-spirit. Wewa knew lhamana, a word that belonged to the Zuni. It existed within a Zuni understanding of the world. It didn't need to be explained or excused or mapped onto anything else.
Right. I mean, even the word transsexual, right, doesn't even come into play for another 50 years here.
Right.
So I guess how are modern queer people trying to claim this history as opposed to,
Well, not so much claim, because I don't know that it's ours to claim, but I think the most honest thing we can do is sit with the question, ask ourselves, if you hadn't grown up in a culture with a strict gender binary, if you'd grown up somewhere with a concept like lhamana, where a person could be twofold one kind and be honored for it, who might you have been? How many people might have found themselves in that particular category of lhamana or something similar and felt for the first time that they fit and didn't have to make that fit them. They just kind of fit it comfortably. How many people who've spent years uncomfortable in masculine roles, who've been told that they're too effeminate or not man enough, might have looked at the lhamana kachina the same way that Wewa did and saw themselves in that way.
Would have been nice.
It would have been nice. And not just lhamana. There are similar traditions in the Zapotec people of Oaxaca or the Fa'afafine of Samoa, the Hijra of South Asia. In fact, you mentioned it at the start of the episode. Scholars have actually documented gender traditions that exceed the binary in well over 100 cultures across history. In fact, what's actually unusual, historically speaking, is our rigid Western binary.
Of course it is. Of course.
After a certain amount of time, the world stopped being kind of enamored and intrigued with, what they saw as this exotic and strange indigenous customs. And they started demanding that cultures like the Zuni become more, quote, American.
Oh, are we talking about erasure now?
Yeah, and the lhamana were among the first targets because they represented something that the colonial Christian worldview just had no room for.
Dany, I want to go back to pot making and celebratory ideas around non-binary, ungendered lines.
Well, we can't. It's gone. They blew it up.
Finally, really did it. You maniacs! You blew it up! Oh, damn you! God damn you all to hell!
So, Wewa was actually imprisoned along with a few other Zuni people in Gallup, New Mexico. But, they rose up, they resisted, they fought back, they ended up securing their release. And then Wewa walked 40 miles back to the Pueblo and went right back to making pottery and weaving and leading ceremonies.
The Zuni are badass.
Yeah, Wewa was incredibly badass. And Wewa continued his duties until he died of heart disease at around 49 years old, which, the Zuni described as a calamity. And it's...
Oh, wow.
I think that description sort of lands differently when you understand how central he was to the community.
Yeah.
And how, smooth his life road had run.
Yeah.
But the pressure didn't stop there. I mean, after Wewa's death in 1896, the U.S. Office of Indian Affairs intensified its assimilation policies across Pueblo communities.
More erasure.
Unfortunately, pressure to abandon the recognition of lhamana mounted throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Of course.
And by the 1920s and 30s, the tradition had been, largely driven underground.
Of course. So, Dany, what was your takeaway when you traveled to the Zuni reservation, and what do we do with Wewa's legacy now?
Well, I think first, I think we need to resist the urge to translate. Mm-hmm. One of my biggest takeaways was that Wewa wasn't a trans woman. Wewa wasn't a gay man. Wewa was lhamana. And maybe the most important thing we can do is just sit with the discomfort of not having a better word in our language for him. right? Because I think that discomfort points at something very real. It kind of points at the edges of what our culture has been able to imagine. And I think we asked the bigger picture that if Western gender binary isn't natural or universal, if it's a construction, that's enforced through colonial violence and institutional oppression, what else could we have been? What other roads might we have traveled if we'd been given different maps,
Star Trek had a map.
Yeah, and Weiwa had a map, and that map was taken away. And wasn't just taken away from Weiwa, but from everybody who might have recognized themselves in it. And I think part of what we owe to Weiwa and other ancestral figures like him, I think, is acknowledging that loss, not just celebrating the remarkable person that Weiwa was, but grieving the framework that made someone like Weiwa possible, and ask whether, piece by piece, we might be able to build something like that back up.
You mean like learning the word lhamana?
Yeah.
Did I do it?
Yeah, you're pretty close.
All right.
Well, that's our episode. I want to say a special thank you to the people and leadership of Zuni Pueblo for their hospitality, and especially the community members who spoke with me during my research and asked me to approach Weiwa's story with care and without assumptions. I hope I've done that justice, even though I know I've only scratched the surface. So if you do want to go deeper on this, Will Roscoe's 1991 biography titled The Zuni Man Woman is so good. It is the most comprehensive account available. It, came to me recommended by the community. But with that, it is, from 1991, it's a little dated. Things have changed a little bit since then. So I would also encourage you to seek out perspectives from contemporary Zuni and Two-Spirit voices. So the book is, the starting point, but not the final word, obviously. But if you like this episode, let us know. If you're listening on YouTube, leave a like, subscribe, drop a comment. If you're listening on Spotify, you can comment there too. You can find more episodes wherever you get your podcasts or directly on our website at .fempodcast.com. If you want to help us keep telling these stories, you can support us over on Patreon.
Come listen to us on Patreon. We watch movies. We have funny commentary about the movies. Danny's less serious and I'm about the same. It's great.
And if you have suggestions for queer histories that you'd like us to cover, especially local histories like this one, please reach out and let us know. Our contact info and a P.O. box are on the website, so you can get in touch with us either by email or, actual mail. Anyway, with that, thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next month.
Bye.